So time now for a look back at the week in politics. Lots to get through, not least the vaccine rollout, of course. That's the positive news story for a government that's facing plenty of questions over its handling of the pandemic over the last year. And I'm joined now by Freddie, Executive Editor at UNHERD, and Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer. Great to see you both, as always. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. Sonia, why don't we start with you? And we'll start talking about the vaccine, because it really is great news. The government has done extremely well with this rollout. We're on track to hit this target.
Yeah, I think it's just absolutely brilliant. There's going to be so many people who were putting great sort of stock by this vaccine rollout. It's incredibly high stakes. Whether we get it all right or not will be the difference between whether we prevent many avoidable deaths and the extent to which we can loosen social restrictions in the sort of weeks and months to come. So absolutely, I've been very critical of this government on some aspects of their pandemic policy, I think fairly so. On the vaccine rollout, it is good news. They are doing a good job, and it's very, very good news that the government is on track to hit its target.
So, Sonia, just staying with you, the Prime Minister a week on Monday will give us his roadmap out of lockdown. And it does seem, from everything that we've heard and read over the last 24, 48 hours or so, that the government is going to be extremely cautious about unlocking the country. Do you think they're almost overcompensating now by being overly cautious for mistakes that were perhaps made after the first lockdown?
Sorry, I lost you at the end there, Jonathan.
Sorry, Sonia. I was just saying, do you think the government is being overcautious now because of mistakes that were made in the past?
No, I think they are doing the right thing by adjusting, because we know, looking back actually, that the government's lack of caution, the fact that it was too late to lock down in the first wave of the virus, the fact that it was too slow to take action when there was evidence that infections were ticking up in the autumn, that has contributed, along with the new, more infectious variant, to the awful death toll that we've seen in the second wave. So it's not an overcompensation to be cautious going forward. It's exactly the right thing to do, because the thing with a virus that spreads exponentially is that the longer you leave it to take action, the worse and longer that action needs to be for when you actually take it. And that's what we've seen with this lockdown. You know, there is a chance that it could have been for less time and less severe if it had happened much earlier. And so I think it's right that the government is cautious. The last thing we want to do, the vaccine is great news. It will enable us to open up in due course, but the last thing you want to do is do that so early. So we need to have which would require social restrictions later on.
OK, let's put those points to Freddie then, because there is this group of backbenchers, Tory backbenchers, Freddie, who are saying that actually all restrictions could be lifted by the end of April if those top 9 priority groups are all vaccinated. I mean, what do you think about those calls?
Well, I think Sonia's right that caution is key, and actually that's won the argument now. I mean, you talk about the letter. This is from a group of Tory backbenchers that call themselves the COVID Recovery Group. They've got 63 signatories to a letter calling for a bit of a clearer, maybe a bit of a quicker timetable in releasing restrictions. But in a way, the amazing thing is how modest those calls are. I mean, in theory, Boris Johnson is a libertarian politician. This Conservative Party has actually presided over nearly a year of on-off lockdowns. And if you zoom out a bit, the astonishing thing actually is how much consensus there's been around that. So, yes, there are calls and there is a heated debate within the Tory party about the speed of opening up. But I think everyone is agreed that caution is the way forward.
What about schools, Freddie, opening up on March the 8th? Should it be every pupil in every school, or should we see some sort of staggered approach?
Well, you hear so much about the potential dangers of opening schools back up, but I think we also need to think about the dangers of not opening the back up. And, you know, it's been, again, nearly a year, which in the life of a young person, a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, is an incredibly long amount of time not to be in school. So I think it's absolutely right that emphasis goes on schools first before anything else. And, you know, it's worth remembering that schools are open in France. in places like Norway, where they did have had a very successful COVID result. They did close schools initially, but the Prime Minister there says she regrets it and wishes she'd kept them open. So this is still a live debate as to just the amount that it contributes to reducing the R rate not to have schools in. And I think emphasis on getting them back is the right approach. And if we can get all pupils back on March the 8th, not a day too soon.
Sonia, what did you make of the Health Secretary's comments in the last day or two that COVID-19 could end up being something that we live with just like flu? Are you expecting us to have a jab every year, to have boosters and to be constantly tweaking vaccines well into the future?
Well, I think it's not just the health secretary who thinks that. There's a lot of scientists as well who think that the course that COVID is going to take with us is that it is going to become endemic, that it will become less fatal over time as we build up immunity that comes from being vaccinated against different variants and strains of the disease. So that does seem to me to be a fairly, I'm no scientist, but I trust the scientists who say that that does seem to be a fairly likely outcome. And while I think, the idea of a virus mutating and becoming resistant to existing vaccines is a worrying one, that is kind of how these things work, and it's what we've come to expect. And I think there are reasons to be optimistic. It's just incredible. I mean, no one would have predicted sort of 13, 14 months ago that we would have 5 effective vaccines against coronavirus. It is just an incredible feat of science. And scientists certainly seem confident that with existing vaccines, we would have to be so unlucky for there to be to be mutations in this virus that would mean that existing vaccines could not be adapted in some way. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic about this. It feels really, really tough now, but I don't think it's going to be. And obviously, there are a lot of people who've lost loved ones who've found this year incredibly difficult, and that's not going to go away, obviously. But I think things are going to be feeling far, far better by the end of this year.
Yeah, we love a bit of optimism. Freddie, should we be optimistic about quarantine hotels? They're coming in tomorrow. I've just interviewed an epidemiologist in Melbourne who says that the only way for them to work is by making sure everyone coming into the country quarantines and that no one is allowed to leave their hotel room. And, of course, they've learnt from their mistakes because they began back in March. Is there a danger that this could be a halfway house and won't work?
Well, I guess there's always dangers in both directions, aren't there? I mean, people talk a lot about Australia and New Zealand as these kind of perfect case studies of places where they've closed the borders and have very strict quarantine protocols. In just the past few days, Auckland, the largest city in New Zealand, has gone back into a lockdown. And of course, the Melbourne Tennis Open has had to close to all visitors because they've gone back into lockdown as well. So even in those countries where they have those very, very strict quarantine rules, there are still outbreaks. And then you compare to a country like the UK, where the degree of international travel is just not even comparable with those faraway places. And actually, our proximity to mainland Europe, the fact that we have the largest airport in the world, we are a travel hub, makes the whole equation a very different one. And I think we need to be realistic, actually, that we can't be shut off from the rest of the world as a kind of long-term plan. And so I'd be very cautious about going in that direction.
Quick thought from you, Sonia, on quarantine hotels?
Well, I think, the question is, what are they for? If they are to try and prevent new troubling strains of the virus from entering the country, it doesn't really work to only do it for a small list of countries, because the problem is that by the time there's a new variant in circulation that could be more infectious, that could be resistant to the existing vaccines that we've got, it's too late. It will have already come in by the time we realised it and put those sort of quarantine hotel measures in place. So I do think, the Independent Institute for Government did question this policy this week and, its objectives. If the objective is to stop new variants coming in, really you have to do it for more than the 33 countries on the red list.
OK, very interesting. I'm sorry we haven't got longer to talk. Always good to get your thoughts. Freddie says, Sonia Sodha, thank you both.